transparency framework has had a pretty huge impact on at least some advertisers. And there's a purchase that just sort of happened where Unity bought ironSource for a whole bunch of money. And Unity is a 3D sort of gaming platform, monetization platform, and they bought another company for over $4 billion that is sort of an app economy business platform. I guess what you'd call it sort of an ad tech platform, right? And the question was put to them as to whether or not the Apple move and the Google move was sort of responsible for this, and they said no, but that of course this sort of positions them in that world a whole lot better, right? So that they can get first-party data. But other analysts essentially have said, well, this is obviously why that they did it, right? Because the world's changing. And there's a quote here from Mobile Dev Memos. Eric Seufert says, this merger is a direct result of Apple's app tracking transparency privacy framework, noting that the stock prices of Unity and ironSource had fallen by 61% and 80% respectively from before Apple's launch of that framework. And now, the ATT clearly isn't exclusively responsible for those declines, but it certainly played a role there. So, the new privacy focus is hurting some of these companies that focus on ad revenue from third-party data. And so now things are sort of changing. So I guess my question to both of you is, are the platforms having more of an impact on our privacy than government regulations, at least in the United States? I guess that's sort of provocative, right?
Want to go first, Seth? Okay, I'll go first. I mean, I think they are. I think, interesting you mentioned Google's horizon, the ship is further and further in the horizon as to getting rid of cookies. I do think we have to qualify cookies in a certain way. I mean, there's certain things I think it's only strictly necessary ones are permissible. But I think if you think when the ePrivacy Directive came into force, it was 2011, and that seems like, ages away in tech terms. So I think you need to look at functional. I certainly would allow functional cookies because although not strictly necessary, I think also certain types of analytics, if you think things like Crashlytics is probably quite a useful one. So I think just calling everything cookies is misleading people. But I also think, calling something flock and now it's fledged, and whether it's a penguin or a canary or whatever kind of bird algorithm they're using, you have to go down to the basics is what is their business model? And it is search and advertising. So whatever way they are going to do it, whether they kind of put a little veneer of privacy on it, they have to track your behavior in some shape or form.
Yeah, let me jump in there because that's an important point for me. So what I mean by that is I think we should entirely let go of the idea that this has to do with advertising. And so what I mean by that specifically is Google, Facebook, and all of the other data collection companies, let's call it that for a second, don't sell advertising, right? That's not what they do. What they sell is social engineering as a service. This is not advertising, right? So advertising is a totally different industry altogether. They offer their clients the ability to manipulate your behavior. Obviously, because, and the reason to make this distinction is there are several for that. So Google doesn't care about the outcome. So Google doesn't care if the outcome is that you're buying something or that you're subscribing to a service or anything else, meaning they don't care if the result is that you're not voting, for example. And to me, that's kind of at the core of the problem. It's kind of the non-directional thing. Seems to contradict what I said earlier about the hammer example. At the same point in time, it's important to understand that this is kind of a, let's call it for a second, a three-sided marketplace, to where I, as the person using this particular tool, think it's serving me when it doesn't, right? It's kind of the real world example would be you're sitting down in your car and your car decides where you're going. That's what's happening. Right?
Yeah. Chris has a pretty negative take on that. What do you think, Seth?
It's interesting because from my seat, of course, Google's core business is indeed advertising, and through these freemium consumer-facing platforms, search, YouTube, and the like, they and Gmail, of course, they collect a treasure trove of consumer behavior, and they get to see behavior across channels, cross devices, and if you're a CMO or an agency, they're certainly who you want to partner with. They're kind of the ultimate frenemy, as we like to say in the industry, because they give you some, but not all of the insights that you're ultimately hoping for when you put money into their machine from an agency or a brand standpoint. And, for years, they were kind of referred to as this walled garden, similar to Facebook and so forth. But ultimately, they're becoming privacy gardens more than anything else. It's almost like they're being forced to put up these walls and limit, the exhaust, the data exhaust that they're able to share. And at the end of the day, it's interesting. They're almost being forced to put up these walls and create these data, castles, if you will, that, it's almost like government regulation is forcing them into these monopolistic situations with data and consumer information. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 for my seat, but fascinating to hear what Christian said. Not that I would disagree with him. It is interesting. I'll have to peel that onion a little bit more before I say anything else.
Yeah, there's an analogy to what happened in other regulatory scenarios. So usually regulation, not usually, but a lot of times you will notice that regulation leads to what we call regulatory capture. A somewhat useful analogy here is what happened in the banking space. So after the banking crisis of 2008, the response of the government, and I actually hate using that phrase, the government, because you should always be more nuanced about that, because governments are functions of society. You should identify the individuals that are responsible for certain policies. But larger point there is, after the banking crisis of 2008, the regulation was changed to the extent that basically no new banks were allowed. And you can follow that. So instead of honing in the banking powers, it had the opposite effect. It enshrined the incumbents. So some people like 𝗵𝗫 have called it it's a coronation event. And that's why I was reminded of that when you used the word castle. Like, yes, you're putting these companies into their position where now other companies can't compete. But anyway, we're going to unplug that. Ultimately, I think we are on a long road to invalidating these business models. I'm going to shut up because I have the tendency to preach about these topics.
But maybe going back to Jeff's previous question about unity and so forth, absolutely it makes sense for an independent, we'll call it ad tech vendor, to pair up with a content creator or a platform, a consumer platform that has all these signals and consumer engagement going on that you can ultimately monetize. So I do think that was a huge factor, if not the factor. So I would agree with Eric in that regard. And he's brilliant. I do follow him as well. He's a great person to follow for mobile and of course, advertising related.
Chris, I can see why people in the central bank don't understand you if you tell them social engineering as a service. They can just about wrap their heads around it. And they're probably from the era when social engineering, I remember, was a term that was used to describe new legislation to change behavior. So, anti-racism legislation was a socially engineering society. Now it has such a terrible connotation, but I remember when social engineering had actually a very positive connotation. So I do think that's kind of interesting. And I do think there is a huge chasm in this space between all the various stakeholders, be it, you know, people who understand blockchain to the people making the regulation. And I think we need to start having the equivalent of Google Translate in how we have these discussions about regulation, about how the code is built, about how the repositories get audited, who's accountable in the supply chain, because, you know, the 2008 banking, it's like, no, it wasn't me, no one was accountable. I just want my bonus. That's fine. And I'll be moved off in 5 years' time and, you know, I'll retire.
Yeah, I could say a lot more to that point, but Jeff, maybe I'll let you chime in first. I do.
Well, I was gonna just sort of take a sort of a broader stance here and say, so, you know, if we're going to get these walled gardens and the walls are getting built higher and higher by you know, Google, you know, taking third-party cookies away, and Apple, you know, building their walls higher, and by the way, there's talk now that Google, not Google, that Apple is going to build their own DSP. There's an article out actually just this week. Apparently, they're looking to hire a bunch of more ad tech folks.
Do you want to tell people what that is for DSP?
Yeah, I'm not.
Or maybe Seth can probably explain that.
Yeah, you want to talk about that one, Seth?
Absolutely. So for those who are not familiar, there's this wild world of programmatic advertising, which is essentially automated buying and selling of ad inventory in real time. And demand side platform is a DSP. So Apple, which was against advertising, you know, except for maybe iAds maybe 10 years ago, they kind of put a toe in the water with advertising, but they were so difficult to work with. Agencies and brands said no thank you, and they sunset that. But yeah, so programmatic advertising is of course a big business, and when you start to put these walls up, as we say, we'll call them privacy walls, it creates a preponderance of advertising opportunities that are exclusive to Apple and that rich data, and of course their ecosystem, which is sizable, to put it mildly. So an opportunity to monetize those eyeballs above and beyond the hardware and the software that they currently you know, have is a new endeavor. So they are going to build this programmatic ad platform, a DSP, to essentially allow the buy side, aka advertisers and brands, to purchase inventory within those pearly white gates that they own.
So how private is my data with Apple? I mean, maybe it's going to be, you know, just as anonymized as Google says that it's going to be within their pearly gates, right? But how trustworthy are these data silos, these data castles?
And ultimately, it doesn't matter, right? Because it's always the same, unless you're the only one that's controlling a copy. As soon as you have a third party, and even if it's encrypted to today's standard, it doesn't matter, right? And people like 𝗵𝗺𝗰𝘁 have been pointing this out at this point in time since 1979, because the NSA collects everything. Like, they have tapes of everything. The phone companies hand this over frequently, right? And even if it's encrypted, ultimately that encryption will be invalidated. It's just it's not a matter of if, it's always a matter of when. So this data should A, not be created, and then B, if it's being created, it must, and again, this is a complete requirement, it must be under your control if it pertains to you. There is no gray area here to be had, right? It's a binary request if we want to live in free societies.
Well, but you know, go ahead, Joe.
But also the politicians are utterly confusing, because on the one hand, they're like, we support privacy, but then they go, but we want backdoor encryption. You're like, what?
Yeah.
And if that mixed messaging is going to the public, no wonder the public are utterly confused, because they're like, oh, I think it's encrypted. And you're like, yes, but in most cases they need a subpoena. And you're like, oh, no, but there's something that will override a subpoena if it's in the case of an emergency. Well, who decides what the emergency is? So you're right, it has to be either private or not. It can't just be a little bit private for some people.
Yeah, and I think it's also kind of wrong in a way to think about this as privacy. I think what we're talking about here is this was an encroachment by our intro. What's at stake here is human agency ultimately, right? It's not privacy.
Autonomy,
right?
Yeah,
self-determination, right? If you need a different word for that, right? That's what we're talking about, right? You should ask yourself, should you be self-deterministic and make your own decision, or do we defer that to some third party permanently, right? Whoever is in charge of the system at any given point in time, because that's always the problem, right? It's not the system itself, it's who gets to manipulate the system, who has the, if you will, the finger on the button of the nuclear bomb, right? Because it's kind of a nuclear data bomb essentially that can go off at any given point in time on any number of people. And you see this on a daily basis. Jeff and I just had a discussion with one of these victims, right? And entirely unprovoked and entirely unjust, and just by virtue of this data existing and someone having control over that, you're subsequent to that. Anyway, sorry, I'm really riled up today because of what was happening this week. So, Jeff, back to you.
Well, I was going to say, there's always a reason why we shouldn't have our privacy, whether it's a positive thing, oh, hey, you can have these apps for free, you can have all these services for free, or it's because, hey, you've got to fight ad fraud, or hey, you've got to make sure that people are paying their taxes, or you've got to make sure the North Koreans aren't tumbling their money, or you got to make sure there's no child sexual abuse material floating around, or you've got to make sure, whatever. There's always some reason why we can't have our privacy. There's always some boogeyman that's in the way of, Americans or anybody around the world having privacy. And I think we have to fight back against that, because there's always going to be some justification for an intrusion into privacy and human agency.
Jeff, I gotta agree with you there, and that's one reason why I like the notion of Web3 ethos and having more agency and ownership and that sovereignty over your data. And it's not a big thing necessarily, but it's a step in the right direction. And that's another, when you think about Google and Apple with Safari and Chrome respectively, their market share is ridiculous. So the value proposition of some of these privacy browsers and the ones that have some sort of blockchain awareness embedded in them, those are wildly fascinating for somebody like me, at least. Not just because of, you get to have the privacy aspect, but the data harvesting that's been going on for such a long time through Chrome, for example. The ability to share maybe not my data per se, but an algorithm that gives you insights into my behavior, and then you allow a brand or an agency to purchase my attention, for particular brands. So that's one thing that I like, that I'm kind of trying to evangelize as far as Web3 is concerned. Not that you and Christian are big fans of advertising per se, but in my world here.
Well, okay, one of my computers picked up more messages than it needed to. Anyway, so the point is a little more nuanced, in the sense of, if people remember some form of network technology history, we created .com specifically for commercial content to live. And unfortunately, we let it slide, and so now on all levels you're being bombarded with commercial messaging, right? So you should have the choice of going to a place where there's actual information and you don't have to think whether or not this is advertising copy. And so it should kind of be the other way around, in the sense that all commercial content should actually live on that level, and all real information should be propagated on all other channels, so that you have a very easy choice. As in, you can pay for a streaming service, you know that you're paying for it, and you're not forced to be interrupted every 5-10 minutes by advertising, right? But since people didn't really appreciate the nuances of these technologies, we basically accepted exactly that, right? So that's why there is no information on the World Wide Web. There is only advertising copy. And there's only advertising copy that's being weaponized by some counterparty on the other end that knows more about you than you know about yourself. So it creates a very unfair scenario. Because you have this perception that you're going to Google to search something, quote unquote. You're not searching anything, right? You're running a query against a database that is completely filled with advertising copy. There are no results in there, right? You're not searching anything. Because unless you're writing it, as you know, Stas, for that particular algorithm, there's a snowball's chance in hell it will end up on the first page of Google's results, right? It doesn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I definitely agree with that assessment, Chris. I mean, there is good information out there, but finding it is really hard, and being able to determine the difference between good information and less good information and complete disinformation is getting harder and harder. And unless we change something, it's going to be impossible. Right? And all of the technology that we have, particularly around social media and with algorithms, whether it's a Google search algorithm or a social media feed that sort of ranks what we see, just makes it that much harder, right, to be able to figure out what the hell is real anymore. And so that's a lot of the problem. But I do think that we maybe have some solutions in the work with Web3 and potentially the control of our identity, and the ability to have some agency over that identity. And maybe solutions like what permission.io is doing, right, where they can, once we control that identity and maybe control our personal data, if we can start to parse that out, and maybe we want to say, hey, you can advertise to me in these particular situations. But we first have to take back a lot of that control, because right now it's just untenable.
Right. Yeah. It's basically interruptive advertising is what we've all come to endure. So this is permission based in its purest form. Are you open to a conversation or a message or a story from a brand? Yes. Great. Proceed. No. Carry on. It's that simple. So yeah, unfortunately, something as simple as that. For whatever reason, we love interruptive ads because we've grabbed somebody's attention. But how about having some manners and asking for somebody's attention? I don't know. Maybe I'm old fashioned.
I mean, even contextual ads, people have seemed to have bought into this concept that behavioral ads are the only way things work, and that contextual ads aren't good enough anymore. I have a bit of a contention that if we were actually just to turn off all the behavioral ads and the only thing that was left for advertisers is contextual advertising, that the world wouldn't grind to a stop, that things would actually work pretty damn well. Now maybe Google would make less money, and maybe that would be a huge amount less. I don't know. I'm sure they would say that the world would stop, right? But I'm not sure it would be that much worse, because I think a lot of the behavioral ad value is in you being able to advertise behaviorally over me who's advertising contextually, right? So I think if everybody was on the same playing field and there were no behavioral ads, we'd actually be in a pretty good place.
Kind of like the old broadcasting model, isn't it? They didn't really know who was watching. They were like, here's a bottle of gin. We think people between these hours might want to drink gin. And that's the way. But again, you know, like in the UK, you had the BBC. You're like, I don't want to be advertised to. I'm going to pay my license fee and I will enjoy, you know, the news and what have you. But it's become very hard for the likes of the BBC to survive, because it's like, you know, compare my license fee income from X amount of population that is also competing with streaming services like Netflix and Disney and what have you to that. So it to quote Seth, it's following the money.
Yeah. But even contextual advertising, I mean, you think about, that's not really going back to the TV model, right? Where you're sitting there passively, right? Contextual advertising is still active, right? If I search for something on the internet, right, that's an actual an active search, and I'm probably interested in whatever I'm searching for. And maybe that's not a purchase intent every time, but a lot of times it is. And if I'm searching for a bicycle, chances are I want to buy a bicycle. But if all the ads around me are for things that are about my past behaviors, that's in the way of me buying that bicycle. And that's what happens now. You're muted, Seth. Go ahead if you.
All right. Yeah, I was going to say contextual versus semantic analysis, just for some of the listeners. Contextual analysis is pretty straightforward. You look for keywords within the constructs of the page. It doesn't get into sentiment or meaning of the word. So like orange, you've got the fruit, you've got the telco company, you know, that's just one. You've got Jaguar, the auto manufacturer, versus the animal. So those are very basic. But when you try to understand the sentiment of a page, sometimes you can think you've got good, we'll call it brand adjacency or brand alignment, and it ends up being very, very bad. So, for example, you know, high-speed automobile, blah, blah, blah. It's an article, but it ends up being about a Mercedes-Benz DUI incident. Well, Mercedes-Benz might not want to put their ad next to that, but from a contextual relevancy standpoint, it looks good. But yeah, there's got to be a deeper analysis of a page. So, but to your point, I would say, you know, based on the campaigns I ran in the past that were contextual or semantic based, got very strong performance versus, you know, trying to do other sorts of targeting. And of course, retargeting is wonderful, but horrible at the same time. For, you know, we won't go through it here, but I definitely share your thought that, you know, if all the behavioral went away and we went with contextual analysis of pages and, you know, align things kind of old school, I don't think we'd skip too much of a beat. Yes, there'd be a revenue drop for some folks, but no, I don't think that's a bad idea necessarily.
Yeah.
Well, I think overall it's a matter of defaults. So by default, wow, that's an interesting picture. So by default, I think we have as human beings the unalienable right not to be surveilled, not to be observed. And so for some strange reason, we're accepting this in cyberspace. You wouldn't accept someone putting a camera in your house or following you around the entire day taking notes, right? You will take issue with that. So if we subscribe to this idea of a metaverse or whatever, right? So, but simply the idea that a lot of our social life and commercial life is happening in digital space. So if we accept that, then we should demand that it's being treated like our home. So it comes back to defaults matter. So the default is you don't get to observe me. There should be a flashlight going off every time there's data being used, transmitted, or generated that pertains to me as an individual. I need to actively consent, and by my default is I'm actively opposing that. So the example I usually make for that, to make this more obvious to people, is very simple. 20 years ago, I checked into a hotel in Sao Paulo and my phone rang. and it was my banker from San Diego, and she was asking, Chris, are you in Brazil? I'm like, yes. And like, you can deduce from this little story that this particular call happened because my purchasing pattern was such that my credit card would not be pulled from a business that is not in North America or some places in Europe that I tend to visit frequently. But that should be the case for all of my digital dust that's being pulled. I should get an alert, and by default, the answer is no, right? By default, you don't get to have it. So the larger point there is, to simplify this yet again massively, we need to demand to change the model from what is kind of a push model, as in I push stuff in front of you and you have to deal with it, to a pull model, as in I deal with the stuff that I actively pull into my sphere of influence, and anything else I don't want to see.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast, and I apologize to whoever I was listening to because I can't remember who it was. They were talking about privacy policies of big companies, and they had gone after a few companies and essentially talking about how their privacy policies didn't actually emulate their business behavior, including a few companies that said, hey, we don't track you, but then of course they sort of do, right? We don't track you without your consent. But consent for them was you downloaded our app, so therefore you consented. But consumers don't actually think that way. Just because I used your website or used your app, well, wait a second, where did I consent? There was no active consent necessarily in the mind of the consumer, the customer. So we need to sort of rethink that, right? Did I actually overtly tell you, yeah, you can use my data and you can send it to all of these advertisers? Or did you just assume that based upon me pressing a button? Because that's not always enough for anybody to actually understand what the hell it is you're doing with their data, often sensitive data, right?
I think GDPR initially, was like classic case of the road to hell being paved with very good intentions with privacy notices. Nobody reads them. I think something far more useful would be kind of data flows that you could actually intercept, like say, I'm happy for my data to go to here, because it fills the scope of purpose. But to Chris's point, I have autonomy and I can stop it at this point. But also to your earlier point about, everyone will have an agenda, whether it be child abuse or, and I think something like public interest has been massively misused. And the example I do when I'm doing training is you have someone in a bikini at a beach and they're just going for a day out. Yeah, they're in the public. Someone takes a photo just because it's incidental, fine. But taking that very same photo, just using that person in a bikini on a billboard, they're both public, but you have to contextualize it. And I think it's the same with, people sometimes conflate national security with public interest. You're like, if it's in the public interest, why don't we all know about it? What are you doing behind closed doors? And I think that sort of citizens type thing needs to start, the groundswell needs to start happening sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Well, and if we're talking about this data, and people not understanding privacy notices, it sort of comes back to the question at hand here, right? Are platform privacy policies actually doing more for us than some of our laws? Is Apple's privacy labels, their nutrition labels, doing more for us than these privacy policies? Maybe so, right? I think just having that little privacy nutrition label is educating the public a hell of a lot more than a privacy notice is, right? Maybe even educating the public on exactly how bad things are.
I think it's putting a Band-Aid on a hemorrhage.
That could be true as well, right?
Yeah.
Well, the primary objective here is the wrong one, or the request is the wrong one. And I don't know why this funny image keeps happening. Interesting. Anyway, so now I think the request comes back to regulators not understanding technology by and large. meaning that this kind of idea or correct request is I have the unalienable right not to be observed. I have the unalienable right for this data not to exist at all, not to be generated at all. That seems utterly obvious to me. I don't actually understand why there's a discussion about like having to forget data. I never consented to this in the first place in any meaningful way. Even, like Jeff said, if you put this consent box in front of people, they will just mindlessly check this every day. It happens a billion times every day, obviously, right? I don't think anybody would dispute that. Or if you ask the next 1,000 people, I would be surprised if one person said, yeah, I read those privacy laws or privacy terms and conditions of that website or whatever it is, and I thought they were reasonable and I consented to that. That's just not happening. That's just nonsense, right? Well, we're just ignoring obvious reality here for no reason.
And this is one reason why, when we're talking about site visits and data collection and analysis and monetization going on, ultimately, I do think in the future here, not so distant future, we're going to see a lot more zero-party data being talked about, and essentially that's intentional sharing of information by consumers with a brand. So it's not I'm visiting the site and they're tracking and monitoring me. It's me saying, I know exactly what I'm doing here. I'm sharing my demographic info, my preferred auto manufacturer, for example, or other information. So I look at it, you've got site visits, kind of first party data versus site submission, actively, knowingly, willingly contributing to the site's data database, and then ultimately you're on the hook, or you're hooked with them in whatever they're doing, but at least you knowingly sign up for it. And in the case of 𝗵𝗺.io, you are agreeing, you're opting in to share your attention and your data, and you're getting something in return. So there's an actual value exchange versus what's going on right now. I could talk about data brokers and that abyss all day long and how ugly that is, but that's my soapbox for zero-party data.
Yeah, explain what you mean by that specifically. I don't think people are necessarily familiar with that concept.
Sure. So for example, like with 𝗵𝗺.io, we offer consumers an opportunity to opt in and share some very basic demographic information, and then they are able to participate in essentially a revenue share model where brands are paying for their time, attention, their data essentially, and they're sharing a little bit of that with the consumer, versus what's going on right now where Google and these large consumer facing companies, they really don't give anything to the consumer. You could say better ads might be the value exchange, but that I don't think most people would say that's a good value exchange or a good trade. And then ultimately, I think consumers in the US at the end of each year are allowed one free credit report for all this data harvesting that goes on behind the scenes that they're not really aware of. But that's kind of lacking from my seat. So zero-party data with 𝗵𝗺.io anyhow is you are agreeing to share information and you're getting something in return. So at a very basic level.
Is the consumer able to make a cost-benefit analysis here? Because in my mind, the risk of doing this is just so far outweighs any benefits, any 5 cents that I might get from my data versus the risk that it is exposing me to.
That's fair. We use end-to-end encryption, and I'm certainly not a technologist, so I would have to have our CTO talk to you about the inner workings of how we maintain the data. But ultimately, it's being done already, and it's being sold many times over by some of our favorite friends that we've already mentioned here. So the fact that we're being above board about, hey, you have an opportunity to participate, and we're actually showing you the brands that are ultimately sharing a piece of this advertising pie with each consumer, I think is a step in the right direction. It's more transparent than what's going on currently. Is it perfect? Probably not. But again, it's at least in lockstep with this Web3 ethos of giving consumers greater agency, which is definitely missing in Web2 through these freemium platforms that we're all using today.
So I think there's sort of an interesting play here. I'm not sure if everybody in our viewership understands this, right? But third-party data is sort of where a lot of things happen now, and that's primarily data brokers, right? Where somebody who you don't even know has your data. First-party data is one mechanism that's sort of starting to happen now, and that would be where, for instance, you interact with a brand like Coca-Cola or Pepsi or even Facebook, right? And Facebook or Coca-Cola has your data, right? So they're not necessarily a broker themselves, but they have your data. And then zero-party data, which is what Seth is talking about, right, is where effectively you own your data, maybe by proxy, maybe it's permission.io has your data, right? But it's effectively an organization or you directly own your data and then are parsing it out to somebody else, right? But you control that data and are potentially giving it to somebody else in return for value, it's just an interesting play. I think there's still potentially some risk if you don't do that right. And I don't know that Permission.io is doing it right. I don't really know a lot about their solution yet, right? But I think it could be done right.
I also think this is a difference between Europe and America, because America is very much free market. We see these as human rights. They're inalienable. You can't commoditize them. And one of the concerns with whether Google does it or another third party does it, the most vulnerable people, in order to make some kind of money, will give you all their data. And actually, they're the very people in society we need to protect. Whereas if we use Chris's example, that we are all equal and we all have the right to say, no, I don't want this to happen. And you can, I think even one of the good things said from what you're telling me is, we have lived in such a frictionless society that people, especially that whole right to be forgotten was certainly in Ireland where I live, was massively debated in Parliament. And it was an utter waste of time because they're like, children do stupid things when they're teenagers. And I was like, yeah, you may be able to delete it from your one child's phone, but do you know how many other children it will go around the globe in like milliseconds? So that right to be forgotten, I think, as well, has kind of led people up the wrong garden path, because it gives people a false sense of comfort. And actually, it's after the fact. And we want to be more proactive than rather reactive with these things.
Well, I think you're right about that, Cheryl. I mean, the difference between a data being, having privacy being a human right and being sort of a commercial transaction is a big difference, right? My concern with first-party data is really primarily the ability to get your data back or get the rights to your data back once you've given it to somebody else. So let's say you give your data to Pepsi, right? Then can you later withdraw that and get all that data back, or has Pepsi copied it and given it to everybody else? But I do think that even in Europe, right, the Data Governance Act, for instance, talks about data unions, right? Yeah. So that's not a whole lot different from what Permission.io and other companies like this are talking about, right? Where they're letting consumers aggregate their data for purposes like this, whether that's monetization or something else.
Yeah, so I think we should treat our data in the same way we treat our organs. So what I mean by that is there are specific laws against you being able to sell your organs. So there's no, like at least in the developed nations, there might be some markets that I'm unaware of where there are actual markets for organs that are legal. But if so, let me know about that. Be interesting to hear about that. But in my mind, there is no difference between like trying to create a market for livers and kidneys and eyeballs and other human pieces than your data, because it's the same thing. As in, you're not getting it back. All right, so it's done. Right, so you unplugged it from your body. You don't control it anymore. It's no longer in your part of your bloodstream and your organism. It's done. Right, so you can never ever get it back. That's it. Right, it's delusional to think that there is control after the fact, as long as you're creating some form of database entries, or at the same point in time, like the way we're handling blockchain-based solutions today, because it's largely misunderstanding of topology, which is a different talk. We're 10 minutes almost past the hour. We started late due to, I'll take about 50% of that blame, by the way, and the other one I'm assigning to Zoom. But yeah, that's going to be part of the post-mortem.
Well, this was a good conversation. Let's let our guests have any last words, and then we'll wrap up here.
Cheryl, I'll let you lead.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would really like to see happening, and I think Chris opened with this, is trying to develop common vernacular between the multi-stakeholders, because as long as we've got the lobbyists lobbying for one thing, the regulators understanding, it totally differently, legislation isn't working, and neither is self-monitoring. And I know the US is favoring self-monitoring. The one thing I will say that I do like that the UK is doing is they are saying they're not using, like the EU, the AI application in one universal way. They're using it for different verticals. So, if you're an infrastructure that's, supplying water, it's going to be different to toys. And I think it is important to do that for the future, just develop this common vernacular that we're all on the same page.
I like that. Chris is definitely thinks that the terminology is important.
Well, Jeff, in that vein, I'll say education is key, and I think it's up to the consumer ultimately. I hate to say it, it's kind of like swim at your own risk at this stage. It's still in the web, whether it's Web 2 or Web 3. So let the consumer beware, unfortunately. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunity with consumer data sovereignty, kind of moving forward here in this next internet, or the next iteration of the internet. And certainly blockchain-based solutions, I think they're in their infancy. So I'm excited to see where consumer data collection and analysis, and where consumer data lives ultimately, if we can do that on the blockchain, and what types of things we can do around that, so you can maintain that agency and ownership without exposing the whole kit and caboodle like we currently do through browsers. But yeah, it's a thrill to be able to connect with you folks, and thanks for the opportunity here.
Great. Well, I want to thank our panelists, Cheryl Rigo. Did I say that right? Is it Rigo?
Yep, that's fine.
And Seth Alinsky. This has been Your Bytes, Your Rights, session 25. Hope everyone has a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. We're going to have a great session.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.